The fog in Knightbridge had always carried secrets, but on this particular morning, it held its breath as if listening to something new. Down where the harbour path met the oldest stack of sea-smooth stones, the rick that fishermen touched for luck, a soft humming rose from the granite, patient as a lullaby, expectant as dawn. The sound wasn't quite music, wasn't quite silence, but something tender that made the mist lean closer, as if the night itself had found something worth protecting. Mara heard it first, that gentle vibration threading through the grey air, as she walked the morning path to gather driftwood for the bakery's ovens. At 17, she had grown used to solitary dawns, the quiet hours before Knightbridge stirred to life. Since her mother's death that winter, these early walks had become her prayer, her way of greeting each day before it asked too much of her. But this morning, the familiar route felt different. The rick sang. She found him nestled against the base of the ancient stones, wrapped in a blanket that seemed to hold starlight even in the grey dawn. The fabric was soft as moth wings, stitched with constellations that shifted and shimmered when she looked at them sideways, as if the stars themselves had been captured in midnight blue thread. The child, a baby impossibly small, watched her with eyes the colour of sea glass, pale green and translucent, holding a seriousness that made her chest tighten with recognition. A note was pinned to the corner of the blanket, written in handwriting that looked like it had been practiced in moonlight. The words were simple, unhurried. His name is Nilo. He listens to the spaces between things. Love him gently. Below the message, drawn with the same careful hand, was a small symbol, 3 stones balanced one atop the other, perfectly aligned. When she lifted him, Nilo's small hand brushed against the rick, and the humming grew softer, more content, like a cat purring itself to sleep. The stones seemed to lean inward slightly, reluctant to let him go, and Mara understood somehow that this place had been waiting for him, that the rick had been singing a lullaby for a baby who belonged to the mist and the morning and the gentle spaces where comfort lives. From the lighthouse rail, Keel paused in his dawn rounds to watch. The keeper had the weather's face but not its temper, and seeing Mara with the bundle, he lifted his hand in a slow salute, as if acknowledging an arrangement older than both of them. "The sea returns what it can," he called, voice careful not to wake anything that preferred the quiet. Mara nodded, not trusting her voice, feeling the child's warmth settle against her chest like a small, steady flame. She carried him home through streets that were just beginning to wake, past windows where lamplight flickered like sleepy eyes. The bakery smelled of rising bread and cinnamon, and when her father saw the child, his eyes cleared for the first time in months. The grief that had made him distant since her mother's passing seemed to step back, making room for wonder. "Well," he said, his voice rough with disuse and surprise, "looks like the morning brought us something better than driftwood." They set up a cradle near the ovens, where the warmth would keep Nilo cozy, and the sound of kneading dough would serve as a lullaby. Flour floated like low stars in the kitchen air, settling on sleeves and hair. And in this gentle chaos, something began to shift. When Mara stacked loaves too quickly and they tumbled, Nilo would gurgle softly from his cradle, and somehow her hands would find the right rhythm. When her father couldn't remember where he'd put the good mixing bowls, the baby would reach toward the correct cabinet with the certainty of someone who had always known where things belonged. The townspeople began to visit more often, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. Mrs. Holloway from the fish market would linger over her morning bread. Old Tom the net mender would accept a second cup of coffee, and conversations at the counter lasted longer, grew warmer, settled into the comfortable spaces between words. Nilo would sleep through it all, his presence like a gentle weight that kept everyone's stories from floating away. As days became weeks, his gift became clearer. He could look at any arrangement, books, plates, folded laundry, the layers of a simple sandwich, and understand the hidden order within it, the way each piece wanted to rest against the next. When he was old enough to sit up, he would reach for stacks with the focused attention of someone solving a puzzle only he could see. If something toppled, he didn't fuss. He would breathe, patient as the tide, and wait until the moment rounded itself smooth again. The fog would lift eventually, as it always did, revealing the harbour and the lighthouse and the ordinary magic of another day beginning. But in those quiet moments before the world fully woke, Mara would find herself humming along with the distant Rick. both of them content to be part of the gentle mystery that had brought them together, watching over a child who seemed to understand that the most important things in life were often the simplest: warmth, order, and the patient art of making space for what needs to be held. The days learned Nilo's rhythm the way a shoreline learns the tide, in small patient repetitions that carved gentle paths through time. By his third year, he moved through the bakery with the careful attention of someone following music only he could hear, pausing at doorways to tilt his head like a sparrow listening for rain, then continuing with the satisfied air of someone who had confirmed that all was as it should be. Mara learned to trust these pauses, the way his small hand would reach toward shelves with a certainty that made her wonder what patterns he saw that escaped the rest of them. The gift revealed itself in layers, like bread rising in the warm kitchen air. When Nilo arranged his wooden blocks, they never toppled, not because he built them perfectly, but because he seemed to understand the conversation each piece wanted to have with the next. The same patience he brought to his toys, he carried to the world around him. A stack of fresh-baked rolls would call to him from the cooling rack, and his small hands would adjust them just so, not by size or color, but by some deeper harmony that made customers linger a moment longer, a soft sigh escaping their lips as they chose their bread. Mara watched this unfold with growing wonder. Her father, still carrying the weight of his grief like a heavy coat he couldn't quite shed, would move through the kitchen with restless energy, his tools scattered, his thoughts tangled. But when Nilo would quietly sort the measuring spoons or align the cooling racks, presenting his father with a simple, perfectly layered sandwich, something would shift. The lines on the old baker's face would soften, his shoulders would drop, and for a moment, the heavy cloak of sorrow seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet, almost forgotten sense of ease. It was more than organization. It was a kind of listening that went deeper than words. When Mrs. Chen came in one grey morning, her usually perfect hair disheveled, her hands shaking as she tried to explain how her late husband's papers had scattered across their bedroom floor, Nilo had looked up from his blocks with those sea-glass eyes, focusing on something beyond her tears. Without speaking, he'd walked to the counter, where Mara was preparing sandwiches, and began rearranging the ingredients, not randomly, but with deliberate care. The lettuce leaves layered just so, the tomatoes nestled between slices of cheese, the bread positioned at angles that seemed to catch the light differently. As he worked, Mrs. Chen's breathing slowed, her shoulders dropping from their tight hunch. "I could help," Nilo had said in his small, clear voice, and something in his expression, patient, knowing, infinitely gentle, made her nod. They'd walked together to her house, Mara following with a thermos of tea and a growing sense of wonder. In the bedroom, where papers lay scattered like fallen leaves, each one carrying weight that threatened to pull Mrs. Chen under, Nilo had simply sat in the center of the chaos and begun to sort, not organizing by date or category, but by something deeper, by the love that had touched each piece, by the story each document wanted to tell. Insurance papers found their way into one neat stack, but beside them went a grocery list, written in Mr. Chen's handwriting, because both spoke of providing and protecting. The love letters formed their own pile, but tucked among them was a receipt from their first dinner out, a movie ticket stub, a pressed flower, all the small proofs that a life had been shared. That love leaves traces in the most unexpected places. Word spread quietly through Nightbridge, not as gossip, but as gentle recognition. The boy who could help things find their right places, who could look at any jumble and see the pattern waiting underneath. But Mara began to teach him about boundaries, about when to offer help and when to simply witness, about the difference between fixing someone's life and helping them see the beauty that was already there. It was during one of these conversations that Keel appeared at their door, the lighthouse keeper with Weather's face, but not its temper. He'd been watching from his tower, he explained, seeing how the boy moved through the world with such careful attention. "Might he like to see the light?" Keel asked, and something in his voice suggested this was more invitation than question. They climbed the cliff path with the sea breathing steadily below. Inside the lighthouse, brass and glass made their own gentle order, gears turning without hurry, the wick wearing its neat trim. Nilo pressed his palm to the great lens as if greeting an elder, and swayed when the foghorn sang its deep note across the water. On the way back, they paused at the old rick, those sea-smoothed stones that had hummed to him at the beginning. Nilo set a small pebble at the base, and the hum rose like a breath you could almost remember. Seasons folded themselves neat as linens. From the bakery window, Nilo would watch Close Counter's neon flutter like a soft heartbeat in the evening mist. He could sense the conversations without their words, the way laughter softened the leather of the booths, the stories gathering there simple as steam. He wanted, without hurry, to be part of that listening when night put on its quiet coat, understanding somehow that his gift was meant for more than just the warm circle of the bakery. It was meant for all the scattered, beautiful pieces of the world that needed gentle hands to help them find their way home. The bakery window had become a frame for longing, and through its flower-dusted glass, Nilo found his gaze drawn again and again to the soft pink glow of Close Counters. The diner's neon sign flickered like a sleepy eye in the evening mist, and something in that gentle pulse called to him the way the old Rick had hummed on his first morning in Knightbridge. At 12 now, tall for his age, and thoughtful in the way that comes from listening more than speaking, he could sense the quiet symphony unfolding within those warm walls, the ebb and flow of shared silences, the brief, bright bursts of laughter, the heavy sighs that seemed to settle like dust motes in lamplight. Mara noticed his quiet longing, with the gentle attention she'd always given to his unspoken needs. She saw how his hands, so adept at arranging loaves and setting tables just so, would pause at the window, almost vibrating with an unspoken desire to bring his particular kind of order to something larger, more complex than the familiar rhythms of the bakery. One evening, as autumn wind rattled the windows and the diner's light seemed especially welcoming against the gathering dusk, she simply said, "They could probably use a quiet pair of hands over there, especially during the dinner rush." It wasn't a command but an invitation, whispered like a secret between them, acknowledging the pull he felt toward that different kind of warmth. The first time Nilo stepped through the diner's door, the bell above let out a tired little ring, as if it had been up late listening to secrets and didn't mind staying up a little longer. The air inside was thick with the scent of coffee and fried onions, and something harder to name, the accumulated comfort of 1,000 small kindnesses. Close Counters kept hours the rest of the town respected, opening when the fog felt thickest and closing when the last lonely soul had found what they came looking for. The booths were upholstered in deep red vinyl that turned friendly under lamplight, and the counter was a strip of wood rubbed smooth by elbows and stories. Behind that counter moved a woman with silver-streaked hair and hands that flowed like water. Her name was Sarah, and she had the kind of laugh lines that gathered like birds in the corners of her eyes. When she looked at Nilo with his sea-glass gaze and careful way of standing, she seemed to recognize something that others might have missed. "Evening, baker's boy," she said, setting down a glass of water like a promise. "I've heard you have a way with making things feel right." Her voice carried the calm of rain on a metal roof, and when she smiled, Nilo felt the same settling sensation he'd experienced that first morning at the Rick. Keel was there too, the lighthouse keeper with weather's face but not its temper, sitting in the corner booth where he always sat, when the automated systems gave him a few hours of freedom. His coat hung open like a sail at rest, salt in his beard and the smell of sea air in the creases of his sleeves. He lifted 2 fingers in greeting and gestured to the stool beside him with the easy manner of someone who understood that some conversations needed space to breathe. "Supper?" he asked, the single word holding more warmth than most people managed in entire sentences. Sarah placed a plate before Nilo, the diner's simple specialty that everyone swore felt like a small mercy. Bread toasted just enough to keep its kindness, crisp lettuce that whispered when pressed, tomatoes catching the light like tiny suns, cheese laid flat as a calm sea, and an egg whose yolk looked like the moon thinking about rising. As he studied the angles, the way each layer wanted to rest against the next, Nilo felt something click softly into place. Not just in the sandwich, but in the room around him. "Food is a kind of light," Keel said quietly, as if responding to a question Nilo hadn't asked aloud. He tapped the counter near the boy's plate, once, twice, to the rhythm of the distant foghorn. "It tells people which way is home, just like the beacon does for ships. But the real secret," he continued, taking a sip of coffee black as the space between stars, "is that a lighthouse doesn't chase after anyone. It just stands steady, sends out its beam, and trusts that those who need it will see it. As the weeks folded themselves neat as fresh linens, Nilo began to understand what keel meant. Close counters drew people who carried their own weather. The fisherman who sat too straight because his back remembered hauling nets. The schoolteacher, whose hands moved like she was still writing on invisible chalkboards. The postal worker who sorted sugar packets, the same way he sorted mail, seeking order in small things when the world felt too large to manage. They came for coffee and sandwiches, but they stayed for something harder to name, something that had to do with the way Nilo arranged their orders, with such careful attention that even the simplest meal felt like a gift. He learned to work beside Sarah in the small kitchen, where every tool was worn smooth by countless hands, every surface bearing the patina of care. She taught him that each sandwich was a small act of faith, someone hungry trusting that someone else would provide exactly what they needed. When he sliced bread, he listened to its texture, understanding how each piece wanted to lie against the next. When he built a sandwich, he wasn't just assembling ingredients but crafting small, edible narratives of comfort. One particularly stormy night, the power flickered, plunging the diner into momentary darkness. A few patrons gasped. Someone's coffee cup rattled against a saucer, but Nilo moved through the sudden shadows with instinctual grace. He found the spare lanterns Sarah kept behind the counter, lit them with the steady hands Mara had taught him, and placed them strategically around the room. Their soft glow chased away more than darkness. It seemed to gather the scattered comfort of the space and hold it steady until the lights returned. "Nourishment," Keel said later. "Watching Nilo arrange a simple turkey sandwich for a late-night traveler can feel like a lantern in the dark. And comfort often tastes like the simplest things, made with the most care." He gestured around the diner with his mug, taking in the way the overhead lights seemed to embrace whoever sat beneath them. "This place, it's a lighthouse too, son. Different kind of beam, same steady purpose." From that night forward, something shifted. Nilo began to sense not just the physical arrangements that wanted tending, but the invisible architecture of people's needs, the way loneliness stacked itself into careful walls, how grief arranged itself in layers that needed acknowledgement in the right order. A sandwich became a conversation starter when the ingredients were layered just so. A cup of coffee stayed warm exactly as long as someone needed to find the words they'd been searching for. As autumn deepened and the fog grew thicker, Nilo would walk home with Mara through streets that felt like they were holding their breath, both of them smelling of different kinds of warmth, she of flour and rising dough, he of coffee, and the particular satisfaction that comes from small kindnesses multiplied. At the old Rick, he began leaving a smooth stone each evening, warmed by his pocket, a quiet thank you to whatever force had brought him to this place where listening felt like a calling. And comfort could be served on a simple plate, with hands that understood the difference between feeding someone and nourishing them. The diner's neon sign would flicker goodnight as they passed, and Nilo would feel the pull of tomorrow's conversations already gathering in the mist. Stories that would need his particular kind of attention, hungers that could be satisfied with more than food. In the distance, Keel's lighthouse beam swept its steady arc across the water, and Nilo understood that he was learning to tend a different kind of light, one that helped people find their way not across dark seas, but through the gentler darkness of ordinary human need. The invitation came with the fog, soft and inevitable as the tide. Keel appeared at close counters, just as the evening mist began to gather at the harbor's edge, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that steamed like a small prayer in the cooling air. He watched Nilo arrange the last sandwiches of the day, each one a meditation on balance and care, then lifted his chin toward the windows, where white tendrils were already beginning to blur the edges of the familiar world. "The sea's brewing up something thick tonight," he said, his voice carrying the particular weight of someone who had learned to read weather in the curve of clouds and the restless shifting of gulls. "When fog gets this dense, when it settles in like it means to stay a while, that's when the light needs more than just machinery to guide it." He took a slow sip of his coffee, black as the space between stars, and met Nilo's sea-glass gaze with eyes that held decades of patient watching. "Thought you might like to see how a different kind of beacon finds its voice." The climb up the cliff path felt like ascending through layers of cloud, each step taking them deeper into a world made soft and strange by mist. The familiar landmarks of Knightbridge, the weathered fence posts, the wind-bent trees, the stone walls that marked old property lines. emerged from the white silence like half-remembered dreams, there for a moment and then gone again. Keel moved with the sure-footed confidence of someone who had walked this route in every kind of weather, his presence a steady anchor in the shifting, uncertain world the fog had created. Inside the lighthouse, the air held a different quality entirely. It was warmer, more focused, filled with the quiet hum of machinery that had been designed to outlast storms and seasons and the particular forgetfulness that comes with too much comfort. The spiral stairs wound upward like a prayer made of iron and wood, each step echoing with the footfalls of all the keepers who had climbed this way before, their hands polishing the brass railings to a warm glow that caught and held the lamplight. At the top, the great lens waited like a patient eye, its faceted surface catching and multiplying the light from the central flame in ways that made Nilo think of his gift with arrangements, but magnified beyond anything he had imagined. Each piece of glass was positioned with mathematical precision, yet the overall effect felt organic, alive, breathing with the rhythm of the rotating mechanism that turned with the steady patience of a heart that had never learned to hurry. Light travels in straight lines, Keel explained, his voice soft in the circular room, but the world is full of curves. Fog, rain, the bend of the earth itself, all trying to scatter what we're sending out, to break it up into pieces too small to guide anyone home. He gestured to the lens, and as if responding to his attention, the beam swept across the invisible harbor, painting the mist briefly silver before moving on. So we gather it up, focus it, send it out strong enough to cut through whatever tries to dim it. We don't argue with weather. We greet it, same as a guest who needs the right kind of welcome. As the evening deepened and the fog grew thicker, pressing against the windows like a living thing, Nilo began to understand the particular rhythm of lighthouse work. It wasn't dramatic or urgent. There were no ships in distress sending up flares, no storms battering the tower with wind and rain. Instead, it was a meditation on constancy, on the quiet faith that somewhere in the white silence, someone might need to know which way was home. Keel showed him the mechanics, with the reverence usually reserved for sacred rituals. The precise trim of the wick, the careful balance of the weights that kept the lamp turning. The logbook, where each night's weather and small mercies were recorded in handwriting that had grown steady through years of practice. "Keel's gift," he said during one of the long, comfortable silences that punctuated their work. "It's not so different from this. You see how things want to arrange themselves, help them find their proper places. But the real secret isn't in the organizing. It's in understanding that some arrangements help people see their way more clearly." The fog began to shift around midnight, not lifting but changing texture, becoming less solid, more willing to let light pass through. Nilo found himself moving around the lantern room with the same careful attention he brought to the diner, adjusting a shutter here, repositioning a spare lantern there, not changing anything dramatic, but somehow helping the light speak more clearly to the mist. It was like arranging ingredients for a sandwich that needed to comfort someone he couldn't see, trusting that the right order would create the right welcome. When the radio crackled with a voice, a fishing boat, overdue and lost in the unexpected thickness of the fog, Keel's response was calm as tidewater. The captain's words came through static and distance. "Can't see the harbor light, but something's guiding us in." Like the fog itself knows the way. Nilo felt a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the lamp's heat, the satisfaction of a puzzle solved without fanfare, an order brought to chaos through the simple act of listening to what was already there. "There's a gentle map under everything," Keel said later, as they shared tea from a thermos that tasted of home and patience. "Not just on charts, but in the way kindness moves through the world, the way comfort finds those who need it most." He gestured toward the beam as it continued its steady sweep, unchanged to any casual observer, but somehow more itself, more true to its purpose. "You're learning to set the wick in places most people don't think to look, helping the light of care burn steady so others can find their way home by more than just sight." As dawn began its slow approach, painting the fog with the faintest suggestion of rose and gold, Nilo understood that he had been invited into something larger than lighthouse keeping. He had been shown how his particular gift for creating order and comfort was part of a vast network of care, some beacons made of light, some made of food, some made of the simple act of listening, all working together to help people find their way through whatever darkness they were carrying. The fog began to lift as they descended the spiral stairs, revealing the harbor piece by piece like a photograph developing in slow motion. Close Counter's neon sign flickered to life in the growing light, and Nilo could see early risers already moving through the streets, drawn by the promise of coffee and the particular comfort that comes from knowing that some places never really close, that somewhere there's always a light burning for whoever needs to find their way home. At the old Rick, he placed a smooth stone warmed by his pocket, a quiet thank you to whatever force had brought him to this place where tending light felt like the most natural thing in the world. The rain arrived the next evening, as if it had been waiting for their footsteps, to leave the lighthouse stairs, beginning as a whisper against the windows of Close Counters and growing into something that settled over Knightbridge with the patience of someone who intended to stay a while. It wasn't the fierce, dramatic rain of storms that announce themselves with thunder and wind, but the kind that seeps quietly into everything: fence posts and window frames, the spaces between stones in old walls, the careful arrangements that hold a town's sense of itself together. Nilo felt the change the way he always did, as a quiet murmur in the spaces between things. Walking home through streets that had grown soft and reflective under the steady precipitation, he noticed how the familiar landmarks of his world were beginning to shift. The cairns along the harbour path, those ancient stacks of sea-smooth stones that fishermen touched for luck, had begun to loosen at their bases. Not toppling dramatically, but settling into new configurations as the rain found its way between the carefully balanced rocks, whispering suggestions of different arrangements. In the bakery the next morning, the change was even more apparent. The usual warm bustle felt subdued, muffled by the constant drum of rain on the roof. Cooling racks that had stood steady for years now wobbled when brushed against. The basket of rolls seemed to ask for a gentler touch, and even Mara moved differently, her usual brisk efficiency replaced by something more tentative, as if the weather had found its way inside her as well as around her. It was during the third day of steady rain that Mara's carefully maintained composure finally loosened. She was folding parchment paper for tomorrow's loaves when it happened, a soft gasp that became something larger, a wave of grief rising from the depths where she'd kept it tidily stored since their mother's death. She sat heavily on the flour bin, pressing both palms to her knees as if steadying herself against an invisible tide, and the tears came not as dramatic sobs but as the quiet, persistent release of someone who had been holding her breath for months. Nilo approached with the careful attention he brought to everything that mattered, understanding that some arrangements couldn't be rushed. Without speaking, he began to create something new on the shelf by the window, not a shrine but an honest conversation between memory and present moment. Their mother's apron, clean but still faintly scented with cinnamon, found its place beside her worn recipe card for honeyed bread. The small tin of cloves she'd used so sparingly sat next to a blue ribbon, and the wooden spoon with its familiar dent from years of stirring love into simple ingredients. "I didn't know where to put her," Mara whispered, the sentence carrying the weight of months of careful avoidance. When Nilo made her tea, setting the cup slightly left of center where her hand always reached first, she touched each item on the shelf with the reverence of someone rediscovering something precious she'd thought was lost. "I didn't know where to put her," Mara whispered, the sentence carrying the weight of months of careful avoidance. When Nilo made her tea, setting the cup slightly left of center where her hand always reached first, she touched each item on the shelf with the reverence of someone rediscovering something precious she'd thought was lost. The rain continued, and with it came the quiet dissolution of other careful arrangements throughout Knightbridge. Hyrics in the distant fields began to slump and spread, their golden orders softening into something more organic. Stone walls that had marked property lines for generations developed gaps where the persistent moisture had loosened ancient mortar. But rather than feeling like destruction, it seemed more like an invitation, the town exhaling a long-held breath and making space for something new to grow. Nilo began his response the way he approached everything, with patient attention to what wanted to happen rather than what should happen. He walked the rain-softened streets with pockets full of smooth stones, not to rebuild exactly what had been, but to listen to what each scattered arrangement was trying to become. At the harbour, he rebuilt the loosened cairns with broader bases that welcomed the rain instead of fighting it, creating small conversations between stone and sky that felt more stable. more honest about their place in a world where weather was part of the design. The work spread naturally through the community. Mrs. Chen found him reorganizing the scattered papers in her bedroom, not the dramatic chaos of before, but the gentle disarray that comes when grief shifts and settles into new patterns. The postmaster discovered him helping sort mail that had gotten damp, creating new categories based not just on addresses, but on the stories the letters wanted to tell together. At the schoolhouse, lesson plans that had curled from humidity were laid out to dry like flags belonging to everyone and no one, reorganized by the rhythm of learning rather than the calendar's demands. As the rain began to tire, showing its exhaustion in the way it softened to mist that could barely hold itself together, Nightbridge had found a different kind of order. The cairn stood with a new stability, the hayricks breathed instead of bracing against weather, and Mara's shelf by the window had become part of the room's natural grammar, a place where past and present could sit comfortably together without either demanding the other move aside. On the final evening of rain, wiping down the last booth at close counters, Nilo found a napkin someone had left behind. Drawn on it in delicate lines was a map of imaginary constellations, stars sketched from memory or longing, the kind of drawing that looked like it was listening for something just beyond the horizon. He smoothed the napkin carefully and slipped it into his pocket like a promise. Understanding that the rain had washed more than dust from the town, it had cleared a path for whatever wanted to arrive next, trusting that some gifts announce themselves as gently as weather, and that the best arrangements are often the ones that leave room for surprise. The napkin with its constellation map had grown soft in Nilo's pocket over the 3 days since the rain ended, its delicate lines becoming as familiar to his fingers as the smooth stones he carried from the old Rick. Each time he touched it during quiet moments at close counters while coffee percolated, or bread toasted to that perfect shade of welcome, he felt the same gentle pull he'd experienced when first. Hearing the lighthouse beam sweep across foggy water, something was approaching Nightbridge with the patient inevitability of tide, and the napkin felt like advance notice, a whispered introduction to whatever wanted to unfold. She arrived on Thursday evening, when the diner held its softest light, the kind of amber glow that made even strangers feel like they were coming home. The bell above the door offered its tired little ring, but somehow the sound carried a brighter note, more inquisitive than usual, as if announcing something new. Nilo looked up from arranging tomorrow's sandwich ingredients to see someone who moved like she was following music only she could hear. Not hurried, not hesitant, but with the purposeful grace of someone who had learned to trust her own sense of direction. Even when the destination wasn't entirely clear, her hair caught the lamplight like autumn leaves after the first frost, and her eyes held the particular shimmer of someone who spent considerable time looking at things far away. She carried a weathered leather satchel and a notebook, thick with papers that spilled from its edges, like thoughts that couldn't quite be contained. Star charts peeked from between pages of handwritten observations, sketches of cloud formations mixed with what looked like careful measurements, all held together by a rubber band that had seen better days but refused to give up its duty. When she settled into the corner booth that caught the best light from the window, she opened the notebook with the reverence of someone greeting an old friend, spreading its contents across the table like she was preparing to have a conversation with the universe. Her laughter, when it came in response to something she read in her own notes, was soft as a match-striking stone, catching the light and fading just as quickly, leaving warmth behind. "Coffee, please," she said when Nilo approached, her voice carrying the warm roughness of someone who spent time outdoors, watching weather change and seasons shift. And whatever sandwich feels right for someone who's been following a map that might be more hope than geography. Her smile held the particular brightness of people who find genuine delight in small mysteries, and when she looked at him with eyes the color of storm clouds just before they decide to rain, Nilo felt something click softly into place. Her name was Rhea, she explained while he prepared her order, and she measured dreams the way other people measured rainfall or wind speed. Not metaphorically, but with instruments she'd calibrated herself, designed to detect the particular frequencies that human hopes make when they're strong enough to influence the physical world. The notebook was full of data from towns scattered across 3 states, each one mapped not just by streets and landmarks, but by the invisible architecture of what its people wished for when they thought no one was listening. "I draw what I can't keep," she said, accepting the sandwich he'd built for her, simple ingredients arranged with the kind of attention that made even ordinary hunger feel acknowledged. "So I draw it again and again until the pattern becomes clear." She showed him pages of sky, puddle constellations, rooftop wind, chalk moons drawn on sidewalks for children and then forgotten. "Nightbridge showed up on my readings 3 months ago. A steady signal, not dramatic but persistent, like someone was creating small pockets of order in a way that helped other people's hopes find their footing. As the evening settled around them and the diners, other patrons drifted away to their own quiet purposes. Nilo retrieved the napkin he'd been carrying. When he placed it carefully on the table between them, Rhea's eyes widened with the particular joy of someone discovering that coincidence might actually be conversation. "I drew that 3 towns back," she said, touching the delicate lines with one finger, "when the instruments picked up something like a lighthouse beam, but made of kindness instead of light. I thought it was just wishful thinking." They compared maps until the coffee grew cold. His internal sense of where comfort wanted to gather, her precise measurements of how hope moved through a community like weather. The overlap was remarkable, not perfect but complementary, like 2 different instruments playing the same melody in slightly different keys. Her chart showed Nightbridge drawn in careful lines that revealed where comfort gathered, where kindness had worn paths between houses, where the invisible currents of care flowed strongest. She'd marked the lighthouse with a small star, the bakery with a symbol that looked like rising steam, and close counters with a tiny heart. "Your town dreams differently than most places," she said, tracing the paths she'd drawn, following routes that corresponded to Nilo's evening walks, his quiet visits to rebuild cairns and reorganize what the rain had scattered. "Most places people's hopes bump into each other, cancel each other out, create static. But here they seem to find harmony, like someone's been teaching them to sing in the same key without realizing they're making music." From his corner booth, Keel raised his mug in a quiet salute, his weathered face holding the satisfaction of someone watching puzzle pieces find their proper places. "Some maps you follow with your feet," he said, nodding toward the lighthouse's distant beacon. "Some you follow with your chest." Rhea smiled into her coffee as if it were a starred page, and Nilo felt the relief of recognition, like finding the right place for a stubborn book on a crowded shelf and feeling the whole case relax by a breath. When she finally closed the notebook and gathered her papers, the evening felt different, not ending but pausing, like a conversation that would continue tomorrow and the day after that. "I usually stay in a place for a week," she said, sliding the rubber band around her collection of dreams and measurements. "Long enough to understand the pattern, short enough not to disturb it. But this feels different. This feels like somewhere I might want to learn the local rhythm instead of just documenting it." Outside, the night air carried the scent of rain-washed stone and the distant salt of the harbor. As they walked toward where their paths would diverge, Rhea paused at the old Rick, placing her palm against the surface the way he always did. When the gentle humming rose to greet her touch, her smile held the satisfaction of someone who had been following the right map all along, and Nilo understood that some arrangements were larger than any single person could create alone, requiring the gentle collision of different gifts working toward the same quiet purpose. The invitation formed itself in the spaces between words, growing like morning light through close counters' windows. Rhea had returned for 3 evenings now, her notebook spreading across the corner table like a familiar prayer, her measurements of hope creating gentle counterpoint to the diner's usual rhythms. When she mentioned that her instruments detected something beyond the harbor, patterns extending past Nightbridge's borders, like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, Nilo found himself saying, "I could show you where it feels strongest." The words surprised him even as he spoke them, not because he hadn't been thinking them, but because they felt like something he'd been preparing to say without knowing it. Rhea looked up from her charts with eyes that held the particular brightness of someone discovering their map had suddenly revealed new territory, and her smile carried the warmth of recognition, as if she'd been waiting for exactly this invitation. They began their wanderings the next morning, when fog was still deciding whether to lift or settle deeper into the valleys beyond town. Their path unfolded like a story being told for the first time, familiar in structure, but full of surprising details. Nilo carried smooth stones from the old Rick in his pocket, each one warmed by his touch, and ready to mark places where kindness had worn paths between moments. Rhea brought her instruments and notebook, but also something lighter, a curiosity that moved like laughter just beneath the surface, ready to bubble up whenever they discovered something worth celebrating. The villages beyond Nightbridge didn't announce themselves. They arrived like gentle thoughts, a curve of houses, a square where benches faced each other like old friends who knew silence was part of conversation. In these quiet places, their kindnesses were as subtle as wind through tall grass. Nilo might rearrange a tumbled woodpile, not dramatically but with the patient attention he brought to sandwich ingredients, creating stability for whoever came next. Rhea would sketch constellations in rain puddles, teaching children that sky could be found in the most ordinary places if you knew how to look. At Millhaven, where river met sea in a confusion of fresh and salt water, they found a farmer whose hayricks kept toppling, despite careful engineering. Nilo approached the problem with his usual listening, understanding that the solution lay not in fighting the hay's natural tendencies, but in finding the conversation it wanted to have with gravity and weather and time. Together, they rebuilt the stack with broader foundations and gentler angles, creating something that breathed with the landscape instead of imposing upon it. When the farmer's wife brought them lemonade and homemade bread, her gratitude felt like sunlight after rain. They discovered that tenderness, unlike urgent calls or grand pronouncements, traveled faster than feet. In Saltmarsh, they helped a librarian organize books not by subject, but by the stories they wanted to tell together, creating unexpected conversations between poetry and practical guides. At Fernbridge, they worked with a postmaster, whose mail had been arriving confused, not because of mechanical failure, but because the building seemed to have forgotten which way was north. Nilo's patient rearrangement of sorting boxes, combined with Rhea's careful measurement of invisible currents, restored direction that had been missing for months. Each evening brought its own small discoveries. Nilo would leave pocket cairns in unexpected places, 3 smooth stones balanced on a windowsill, a single pebble nestled in the crook of a gnarled tree. These weren't grand gestures but quiet affirmations, little whispers saying, "You are seen, this place is held." Rhea would trace imaginary lines between reflected stars in puddles, creating temporary maps that spoke of cosmos mirrored in the smallest, most transient things. Their conversations moved like water over smooth stones, touching everything and nothing. "I used to think my work was about documenting patterns," Rhea said one evening, as they sat beside a stream that reflected first stars like scattered coins. "Recording how hope moves through communities. But watching you work, I think maybe the real purpose is participation, not just measuring the music, but learning to sing along." They developed their own gentle rhythm, walking early when light wore its softest face, sharing sandwiches Sarah pressed into their hands like blessings, finding places to rest where stars felt close enough to touch. Sometimes along unmarked lanes or at field edges, they would hear it, the faintest suggestion of a hum like the one at Nightbridge's Rick. They found smaller stacks in unexpected places, 3 bricks behind a post office, oyster shells beside a ferry sign, book spines in a thrift shop window. Nilo would touch each, listening, while Rhea sketched their silhouettes as if capturing how their balance felt, rather than how it looked. They learned that the world beyond Nightbridge wasn't chaotic disarray, but a grand, sprawling arrangement constantly seeking its own gentle balance. Their task wasn't to impose order, but to listen to whispers of what already wanted to be ordered, helping scattered pieces find their way back to harmonious wholeness. When Nightbridge's lighthouse beam first appeared in the distance, steady as a heartbeat against evening sky, they walked slowly home. At the old Rick, Nilo added a new pebble, testimony to the day's quiet discoveries, while Rhea rested her palm against ancient stones, feeling the familiar hum. They understood now that their gifts were part of something larger, a network of care extending far beyond any single town's borders, and that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to help the world remember how beautiful it could be when tended with gentle hands. Close counters waited for them with the patience of an old friend, the evening light pooling softly across the booths and the bell above the door giving its quietest, most familiar chime. Nilo and Rhea slipped inside, as if returning to a room that remembered their footsteps, bringing with them the gentle hush of distant roads and the warmth of stories gathered from other small towns. Sarah glanced up from polishing the coffee machine, her eyes twinkling with the kind of knowing that needs no words. She set out a fresh chalkboard on the counter, drawing a line beneath the words, "Today's small comforts." The space left below was wide as a promise. They filled it slowly, each in their own way. Nilo wrote warm tomato on toast, spacing the letters so they seemed to rest against one another in quiet companionship. Rhea, notebook always within reach, drew a small shining star on the board, its lines so delicate they seemed to float just above the chalk, as if hope could be both fragile and persistent. Sarah added sliced pears with a pinch of salt, her laughter gently echoing along the counter, like lantern light moving through the dusk. The diner was more than a place to eat. It had become a kind of gentle embassy, a place where weary hearts and tangled memories could find rest without needing to explain themselves. The fisherman arrived first, as he often did, shoulders hunched, hat set beside him as if holding a space for someone remembered. Nilo brought him coffee and a sandwich layered as gently as river meeting sea, and set the plate with a precision that whispered, "You're seen here." He didn't ask questions, only placed a napkin at a careful angle, then lingered long enough for the silence to soften. "I keep hearing him," the fisherman said, voice low and tidal. "My father, always telling me to read the wind better, to come home sooner." No reprimand, only the tiredness of someone carrying too many invisible nets. From her booth, Rhea drew a tiny north-pointing compass on a napkin and nudged it toward him. "Some directions we learn late," she said, her voice as gentle as the dusk. "The boat still finds its way back." The fisherman traced the compass with a calloused fingertip, and for a moment his shoulders eased, the room itself almost exhaling. Mid-afternoon brought the tailor, who kept a tin of fabric scraps like a secret. She ordered tea, her eyes flickering over the room as if measuring its seams. "I can't throw these away," she confessed, laying out triangles of silk and cotton. "There's memory in all the edges." Nilo cleared a side table and began arranging the scraps by feel, texture beside color, patterns finding their companions across the space. Rhea drew the outline of a quilt not yet sewn, a gentle path the tailor's hands could follow when the time was right. By the time the tea cooled, the tin held a plan, and the tailor's eyes shone with the relief of a room that finally knew where everything belonged. Close to dusk, the schoolteacher arrived, her hair always a little out of place, pockets bulging with lost things, keys, erasers, a single mitten. "They hide where I've just been," she said, smiling with resignation. Nilo handed her a sandwich from the chalkboard and pointed to the jar of chalk on the shelf. "Draw their favorite places," he suggested, half in play. She did, marking tiny keys by the window, the sugar jar, the coat rack. By closing time, the keys jingled from her wrist on a red thread, and she laughed. I think they just wanted to be counted. Keel's step was the last. Measured and slow, the lighthouse keeper's silhouette framed in the doorway like a lantern in fog. He watched as the fisherman's shoulders lowered. The tailor smoothed a patchwork future between her palms. The teacher's keys formed a new constellation. Meeting Nilo's eyes, Keel offered a quiet salute, the kind that said light has reached where it was needed. Later, as the neon sign at the window pulsed its steady breath, Mara arrived, hair damp with mist, her coat clutched close. The bell's ring faded into hush, and Sarah, who understood timing better than anyone, placed a pot of chamomile tea on the counter. Mara sat in the booth that caught the harbor's blinking reflection and stared at her hands, the crescent of flower beneath one nail, a gentle reminder of home. Nilo brought a sandwich that tasted like the house they'd grown up in, honey on buttered bread, a curl of salt, the comfort of something learned by heart. He set it just to the left, where Mara's reach always went first. He didn't always understand her words, but he understood the shape of her heart, the way grief moves in tides and eddies, not in straight lines. "I thought I'd made room," Mara whispered. But today, the recipe card for the holiday bread, it disappeared. It felt like losing a doorway. Rhea joined them, quietly widening the moment. She opened her notebook and sketched their mother's shelf, the apron, the ribbon, the spoon. "Doors remember us," she said softly. "Sometimes they go quiet so we remember to knock." Nilo folded a napkin and tucked it beneath Mara's plate, anchoring the world so it couldn't drift. "We'll look together in the morning," he promised, as steady as the returning tide. They sat together in the diner's hush, lamplight wrapping the room in a gentle shine. Mara drank her tea, Rhea's pencil whispered across paper, and Nilo watched as the world for a moment needed nothing more than to be gently held. When Mara finally smiled, small and real, the kind of smile that learns to stay, Nilo felt the diner itself relax, as if the walls had remembered their purpose. Outside, stars took their places, and the lighthouse sent its greeting over water. As Sarah locked the door, chairs perched on tables like resting birds, and the chalkboard waited for tomorrow's small promises. At the threshold, Mara touched Nilo's sleeve, a brief press that meant more than words. "You make rooms remember themselves," she murmured, and though he had no answer, he understood the trust in her voice. They walked home beneath a sky that shimmered with the hush of belonging. At the old rick, Nilo placed a smooth stone, the gentle hum rising to meet their quiet. Rhea leaned her shoulder to his, just enough to feel the world arrange itself, for one breath and the next, into something that felt like home. The morning after they found their mother's recipe card brought a different quality of light to close counters, as if the gentle resolution of Mara's search had cleared something in the air itself. Nilo moved through his familiar routines with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed a small piece of the world finding its proper place. But his attention kept drifting to the corner booth, where Keel usually sat. The lighthouse keeper's absence felt like a pause in a familiar song. Not alarming, but noticeable in the way that made you listen more carefully for the next note. When Keel finally appeared, his steps carried a different rhythm than usual, not urgent but more deliberate, as if each movement required a moment's consideration before committing to it. His weathered hands gripped the counter with the kind of attention that spoke of joints remembering their age. And when he lifted his coffee mug, Nilo noticed the slight tremor that made the ceramic sing a barely audible note against the saucer. The lighthouse keeper's eyes still held their steady beam, but maintaining that focus seemed to require more effort now, like tending a flame in increasingly restless wind. "The mechanism's been having conversations with itself lately," Keel said, accepting his usual black coffee with a nod of gratitude. "Not complaining, mind you, just singing a different tune than it used to. Like it's trying to tell me something I haven't quite learned to hear yet." His voice carried the particular weariness of someone who had spent decades reading the subtle languages of weather and machinery, understanding that the most important communications often came through the smallest changes in familiar patterns. Over the following weeks, their evening walks to the lighthouse took on the quality of gentle pilgrimage. Keel moved more slowly up the spiral stairs, his hand trailing along the brass railing, with the reverence of someone saying goodbye to an old friend. In the lantern room, he began teaching Nilo the deeper mysteries with unhurried precision, how to read the quality of light, not just by its brightness, but by the way it moved through the lens, how to adjust the wick so the flame never wavered, even when storms pressed against the windows like impatient visitors seeking shelter. A lighthouse keeper's real work, Keel explained during one of their quiet hours. The beam sweeping its patient arc across water that held the first stars like scattered coins isn't just maintaining the light. It's learning to trust that the light knows its purpose, that your job is to tend the conditions that let it shine clearest. He gestured toward the harbor, where late fishing boats moved like prayers across dark water, each one following the beam home. "Same with your gift, son. You don't create order from chaos. You help what wants to be ordered find its natural arrangement." The first real storm of the season arrived on a night when the air itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Wind shrieked around the lighthouse tower like a living thing, testing every joint and seam, and rain lashed against the great lens with the persistence of someone demanding attention. But Keel's response was calm as still water, his movements unhurried, as he checked the mechanisms and adjusted the shutters. "Say a storm," he said, his voice barely audible above the din, "is just the sea clearing its throat. It needs to be greeted, not fought." He showed Nilo how to make tea during the tempest, strong and sweet with honey, understanding that some rituals create islands of calm within chaos. As they sat in the lantern room, the lighthouse beam cutting through sheets of rain and wind-torn darkness, Nilo learned that greeting a storm wasn't about defiance, but about finding a steady center that weather couldn't disturb. The warmth of the tea, the patient glow of the lamp, the rhythmic sweep of light across the roiling night, these were quiet, assertions of hope against the overwhelming power of natural forces. When the storm finally exhausted itself and dawn painted the sky in shades of pearl and rose, Keel's satisfaction was profound but gentle. "Some nights test what you think you know," he said, making notes in the logbook with handwriting that remained steady despite his tiredness. "But the real test is whether the light stayed true to itself, whether it kept faith with everyone who needed to find their way home." His rest came as softly as a closing door, without struggle or fanfare. One morning, Nilo arrived to find the lighthouse beam sweeping its familiar arc across water that reflected the early sun like scattered promises. But Keel was not in his chair by the window, nor making his usual rounds. He lay peacefully in his narrow bed, hands folded over the worn logbook, a faint smile on his lips as if he had finally completed the last entry of a long, well-kept life. The news moved through Knightbridge like a gentle tide, bringing not shock, but a collective understanding that Keel had simply become part of the quiet order he had so faithfully maintained. At close counters, Sarah lit an extra candle that danced softly in the morning light. The fisherman lingered over his coffee, gaze fixed on the distant lighthouse, as if expecting to see Keel's steady hand still guiding the beam home. Nilo felt the absence keenly, but it was not an empty space. It was filled with the quiet wisdom Keel had shared, the unspoken lessons of constancy and care. He continued the evening vigil, trimming the wick with the precision he'd been taught, checking the mechanisms with reverent attention, understanding that he now carried more than technical knowledge. He had inherited the art of steady welcome, the faith that small acts of care repeated with consistency and love could create something larger than themselves, a beacon that helped others navigate not just physical darkness, but the gentler confusion of ordinary human need. The lighthouse beam swept its eternal arc across the harbor, unchanged in its rhythm, steady as a heartbeat against the vast night sky. In tending that light, Nilo discovered he was learning to be a lighthouse himself, not just maintaining machinery, but standing steady, greeting storms with calm, trusting that even the gentlest illumination could cut through darkness and help weary souls find their way home. The weeks that followed Keel's acknowledgement of his body's changing rhythms brought a different quality to their evening climbs up the lighthouse stairs. The keeper moved with the deliberate grace of someone listening to internal weather, his weathered hands trailing along the brass railing, not from weakness but from a deeper kind of attention, as if saying goodbye to each familiar surface. In the lantern room, he began sharing the subtler mysteries with unhurried precision, how to read the flame's mood in the way it danced against the wick, how to sense when the great lens needed cleaning, not by looking but by feeling how the light moved through it. Rhea had extended her stay in Knightbridge, her instruments detecting patterns that seemed to deepen rather than resolve. She and Nilo began working together in ways that felt like conversation between different languages of care. Her charts showed where hope gathered in the town like morning mist in protected valleys, while his gift helped those invisible currents flow more freely through the physical spaces where people met. They discovered that Close Counters had become more than a diner. It was a kind of gentle embassy where the scattered pieces of human experience could find their proper arrangements. During one of their collaborative evenings, mapping the emotional geography of Knightbridge by lamplight, Rhea traced the paths of care that connected the lighthouse to the harbor, the bakery to the diner, the old rick to the places where people paused to touch stone and remember they were held. "We're documenting something that's already complete," she said, her voice soft with wonder. "This town has learned to dream in harmony. My instruments don't just measure hope anymore. They're recording a kind of settled peace I've never encountered before." Nilo understood the unspoken question in her words. Her work was about discovery, about finding the edges where communities were still learning to sing together. Knightbridge had found its song, and while that was beautiful, it meant her particular gift was needed elsewhere. He felt the familiar ache that came with recognizing necessary departures, but also something deeper, the satisfaction of understanding that some arrangements were meant to teach people how to create other arrangements, like a lighthouse beam that helped ships find their way to harbors where they could learn to become lighthouses themselves. Keels. Rest came as gently as a tide reaching its furthest point and pausing before the return. One morning, Nilo found him in his narrow bed, hands folded over the worn logbook, a faint smile on his lips as if he had just finished writing the perfect final entry. The lighthouse beam continued its eternal sweep, unchanged in rhythm and in that constancy. Nilo heard Keel's last lesson, that the most important work was the kind that continued itself, that created conditions for light to shine steady, long after any individual keeper had stepped away from the lamp. The town received the news like a gentle tide, bringing not shock but collective understanding. At close counters, Sarah lit an extra candle that danced softly in the morning light. The fisherman lingered over his coffee, gaze fixed on the distant lighthouse as if expecting to see Keel's steady presence still guiding the beam home. But there was no sense of abandonment, only the deep satisfaction that comes when someone completes their work so thoroughly that it becomes part of the world's natural order. In the days that followed, Nilo discovered he had inherited more than technical knowledge. He carried forward the art of steady welcome, the faith that small acts of care, repeated with consistency and love, could create something larger than themselves. Tending the lighthouse beam felt like continuing a conversation Keel had begun decades earlier, and at close counters, arranging sandwiches with patient attention felt like adding verses to a song the whole town was learning to sing. Rhea began, preparing for her departure with the same unhurried care she brought to all her observations. Her maps of Nightbridge were complete now, showing not just the physical layout, but the invisible currents of kindness that flowed between houses, the places where comfort gathered, the gentle architecture of a community that had learned to hold itself together. She packed her instruments with reverent attention, understanding that they would soon be needed to help other places find their own harmonies. On her final evening, they walked to the lighthouse together, the beam sweeping its familiar arc across water that held the first stars like scattered promises. In the lantern room, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the light do its quiet work. Keel was right about lighthouses, Rhea said, her voice soft in the circular space. They don't chase after anyone. They just stand steady, send out their beam, and trust that those who need it will see it. But the real secret is that some beams are meant to help people become lighthouses themselves. She reached into her satchel and withdrew a small piece of sea glass, smooth and translucent, the color of deep water under starlight. "This is a promise," she said, pressing it into Nilo's palm, "that some connections, once made, become part of the map no matter how far you travel. When you look up and see clouds arranged like handwriting, you know that somewhere I'm still learning the language we started here together." The next morning brought fog thick as silk, and through it Rhea departed as quietly as she had arrived. Nilo stood at the lighthouse window, the sea glass warm in his pocket, understanding that he had learned to let go without letting loose, to find her presence not in her physical location, but in the way kindness moved through the world, carrying forward the patterns they had discovered together. At close counters, he continued the work they had begun, serving simple meals with attention that helped people remember they were seen and valued. The lighthouse beam swept its eternal arc, and in tending that light, Nilo understood he was part of a vast network of care, some beacons made of light, some made of food, some made of the simple act of listening, all working together to help people find their way through whatever darkness they were carrying. The old Rick hummed its ancient song when he touched it each evening, and in that sound, he heard the echo of all the care that had been tended in this place, all the light that would continue to shine long after any individual flame had been entrusted to other hands. The weeks following Rhea's departure settled into close counters like morning light finding its familiar places, gentle and unhurried. Nilo moved between his dual callings with the easy rhythm of someone who had learned that tending different kinds of light required the same steady attention. Whether trimming a lighthouse wick or arranging ingredients with care that helped people remember they were seen, the sea glass in his pocket had grown warm from handling, its smooth surface catching lamplight when he turned toward windows. And sometimes he found Rhea's handwriting in the way clouds arranged themselves above the harbor, temporary messages written in a language only he had learned to read. It was during one of those quieter afternoons, when the diner held only the soft murmur of the coffee machine and the distant conversation of gulls, that the bell above the door offered its familiar chime with a slightly different note, brighter, more curious, like a question being asked for the first time. Through the doorway came someone small enough that the afternoon light seemed to gather around them, a child who moved with the careful attention of someone listening to something just beneath the surface of ordinary sound. Ash appeared to be about 10, though their eyes held the focused intensity of someone who had been paying attention to the world with unusual care for most of those years. Their hair stuck up in directions that suggested recent friendship with ocean wind, and their jacket pockets bulged with the kind of treasures that only made sense to someone who understood that the most important discoveries were often the smallest ones. When they approached the counter, with the confidence of someone who had never met a stranger, only people they hadn't been properly introduced to yet, Nilo felt the familiar gentle click of recognition that came when the world presented him with a new arrangement waiting to find its proper place. "Sarah mentioned you might need an extra pair of hands," Ash said, their voice carrying the particular clarity that comes from having practiced important conversations until they're ready to be spoken aloud. They gestured toward the kitchen with the kind of hopeful energy that suggested they were better at enthusiasm than actual dishwashing, but possessed the rare quality of being willing to learn whatever needed learning. Sarah appeared from behind the coffee machine with timing that suggested she had been listening from just out of sight, her eyes bright with the kind of interest that came when life presented unexpected gifts. She set a glass of milk beside Ash's elbow and exchanged a look, with Nilo that carried entire conversations about the way some arrivals felt less like coincidence than like the world. Remembering something it had temporarily forgotten, Ash's first attempts at helping were, predictably, a gentle chaos. Cups rattled against saucers like nervous laughter, napkins fluttered to the floor like startled birds, and the simple act of wiping a table often resulted in more smudges than shine. But what Ash lacked in coordination, they made up for with an earnest desire to understand and, most remarkably, an uncanny ability to listen. When the fisherman sighed his particular sigh of someone carrying invisible nets, Ash would pause, head tilted, as if trying to catch the exact shape of the sound. When the schoolteacher spoke of her day, Ash absorbed not just the words but the unspoken currents beneath them, their sea-glass eyes reflecting a quiet empathy that reminded Nilo of his own childhood gift for hearing what people needed before they knew how to ask for it. "You see conversations," Nilo observed one evening, watching Ash carefully arrange condiments on a freshly wiped table. "Not just between people, but between things. The way the salt wants to sit next to the pepper, how the napkins prefer to lean against the sugar dispenser rather than stand completely straight." Ash nodded with the serious attention of someone having their secret language acknowledged for the first time. It was during the following week that Nilo began teaching Ash the deeper mysteries, starting with what he had always considered the heart of his calling. He placed a fresh loaf of bread on the cutting board, still warm from Mara's ovens, and gestured for Ash to join him in the small kitchen, where every surface had been worn smooth by countless acts of care. "A sandwich," he began, his voice taking on the meditative tone he reserved for explaining truths that couldn't be rushed, "isn't just ingredients stacked together. It's a conversation where each layer has something important to say to the next, and your job is to help them find the harmony they're looking for." He showed Ash how to slice the bread with an even hand, listening to the soft whisper of knife through crust. "This is the foundation," he explained, buttering one side with careful attention. "It needs to be steady but also welcoming, ready to hold everything else that wants to join the conversation." The lettuce came next, crisp leaves that caught the light like small green flags. "These add freshness," Nilo said, arranging them so they lay flat and inviting. "They're the gentle voice that keeps everything else from becoming too heavy, too serious." Then the tomatoes, sliced thin and gleaming like tiny suns. "These are the bright moments, the unexpected joy. They need to be nestled just so, supported by what comes before, ready to support what comes after." Ash watched with the absolute absorption of someone learning a new language, their small hands unconsciously mimicking Nilo's movements. When he added cheese and a careful spread of mustard, explaining each addition not in terms of flavor, but in terms of how it contributed to the overall feeling of care and nourishment. Ash began to nod with understanding that went deeper than words. And finally, Nilo concluded, placing the second slice of bread on top, with the reverence of someone completing a small prayer. The cover. It brings everything together, holds it safe, makes it feel complete. Like a lullaby that helps all the other songs remember how to harmonize. He handed the finished sandwich to Ash. Now taste it, but don't just taste the flavors. Taste the conversation, the way each ingredient found its proper place in relation to all the others. Ash took a bite, eyes closing for a moment in concentration, and when they opened again, they held a new kind of wonder. The satisfaction of someone who had just learned to hear music they had always felt but never quite understood. In teaching Ash to build sandwiches like gentle architecture, each layer supporting the next, Nilo discovered new rooms inside himself, spaces illuminated by questions he had never thought to ask. The child's innocent curiosity. Why did the coffee machine hum differently on foggy days? Why did certain arrangements of salt and pepper shakers seem to help conversations flow more easily? Opened doorways in his understanding that he hadn't known existed. He realized that the quiet wisdom he had accumulated from Keel's patient lessons and Rhea's sky-drawn questions wasn't meant to be kept like a private treasure, but shared like lighthouse beams, helping others find their way toward their own forms of gentle illumination. The regulars began to notice changes they couldn't quite name. The fisherman found himself lingering longer over his evening meal, the weight on his shoulders distributing itself more evenly. The tailor discovered that her fabric scraps were arranging themselves into patterns that made sense in ways she trusted completely. And the schoolteacher reported that her perpetually misplaced keys had begun staying found, as if the diner itself was learning to hold things more carefully. As autumn deepened and the lighthouse beam continued its eternal sweep across the harbor, Nilo understood that he was witnessing something precious, the chance to pass forward the particular kind of attention that had shaped his own understanding of how care moved through the world. At the Old Rick each evening, he began leaving 2 smooth stones instead of 1, a quiet acknowledgement that some gifts grew brighter when shared, that the most important arrangements were often the ones that taught others how to create their own harmonies. In the gentle space between teacher and student, he found a different kind of light, one that illuminated paths he was only beginning to understand, trusting that Ash would help him discover where they led. The fog arrived with a peculiar thickness that week, not the familiar mist that Nightbridge wore like a comfortable shawl, but something denser, more persistent, settling over the town with the patience of someone who intended to stay until properly welcomed. It wrapped itself around familiar landmarks like silver silk, making the lighthouse beam work harder to cut through the thickened air, turning the harbor into suggestion and the streets into soft mysteries, where footsteps sounded muffled and voices grew gentler without meaning to. Nilo felt the change first in the spaces between things, the way he always did. At close counters, conversations became shorter, punctuated by longer silences that felt less like comfortable pauses and more like small, uncharted distances. The fisherman would stir his coffee endlessly, his gaze lost in steam that seemed to mirror the world outside. The schoolteacher's fingers tapped restlessly on the counter, her mind visibly searching for something that felt just beyond reach, while the tailor sat straighter in her booth, as if trying to see through walls that had grown suddenly thicker. Ash approached the fog with their characteristic curiosity, standing at the diner's windows with breath creating small clouds on glass, watching familiar landmarks appear and disappear like half-remembered thoughts. "It's not hiding things," they observed with the clarity that often surprised adults who had forgotten how to see the obvious. "Care's just making them more gentle, like someone drew the world with watercolors instead of sharp pencils. But people are forgetting how to find each other. Together, they began weaving small rituals into the fabric of the fog-wrapped days, not to fight the weather, but to acknowledge its presence and offer different kinds of warmth within its embrace. The first was sound. At noon, precisely when the sun should have been at its highest but remained a hidden memory, Ash would ring the small silver bell Sarah kept behind the counter. Not urgently, but with 3 slow, deliberate chimes that Ash insisted meant one for finding, one for holding, one for being held. The bell's song cut through the muffled air with gentle authority, and within days, heads would lift in homes and shops throughout Nightbridge, A momentary pause in whatever quiet task people were engaged in, a shared breath that connected them across unseen distances. It became the town's heartbeat, a reminder that time was still passing. That community still existed, even when its edges had grown soft and uncertain. Then came the cocoa for long whispers, rich and dark, prepared in large pots during the afternoons, when conversations seemed to stretch and lose their shape in the thick air. Nilo showed Ash how to add just a pinch of clove and a memory of cinnamon, creating warmth that went deeper than temperature. They would carry thermoses through the fog-wrapped streets, delivering comfort to shops and houses where people had begun to feel isolated in their own familiar spaces. But it was the lanterns that truly transformed the feeling of the town. Starting with close counters, then spreading to the bakery and beyond, they placed small, battery-operated lights in windows, not bright or urgent, but soft amber glows that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the fog itself. Like stars learning to breathe, Ash said, watching the first one flicker to life in the diner's window. And Nilo understood that his student was beginning to speak the same language of gentle metaphor that had shaped his own understanding of how care moved through the world. Soon, other houses began to follow suit. Mrs. Chen's window bloomed with warm light. The fisherman's cottage added its own gentle beacon, and the schoolteacher's porch glowed like a quiet promise. Each lantern was a small conversation between neighbors that needed no words, a network of shared comfort that reassured everyone that no one was truly alone. Even when the world felt wrapped in silver silence, Ash moved through these fog-wrapped days with growing confidence, their initial enthusiasm refined into purposeful grace. They learned to carry multiple orders without rattling cups, to arrange lanterns so their light felt most welcoming, to recognize when someone needed cocoa for long whispers before they knew to ask for it themselves. In teaching these small acts of service, Nilo discovered new rooms in his own understanding, spaces illuminated by questions he had never thought to ask. "The fog is teaching us something," Nilo said during one of their quiet moments, watching how the diner's customers had unconsciously arranged themselves into a temporary family, sharing food and stories, and the particular comfort that comes from being together when the world feels uncertain. About how community works when you can't see the edges, when you have to trust that care will find its way to where it's needed. The fog didn't lift suddenly. It simply began to thin almost imperceptibly, as if it had been gently persuaded to release its hold. One morning, a faint blush of pink appeared on the eastern horizon, a promise of light that had been patiently waiting its turn. The lanterns, still glowing in windows throughout Nightbridge, now seemed to greet this returning clarity, their purpose fulfilled not by banishing darkness, but by holding it gently until dawn remembered its way. Standing at the lighthouse window, watching the first hesitant rays of sun find their path through the retreating mist, Nilo felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. The fog had been more than weather. It had been a gentle teacher, showing them how community could create its own forms of navigation when usual landmarks became uncertain. At the old rick that evening, he and Ash each placed a smooth stone, the ancient hum rising to acknowledge that some lessons were best learned together, that the most important light was often the kind that helped others learn to shine. The scent arrived first, carried on the morning breeze that finally swept the last wisps of fog from Nightbridge's streets, pine and distant rain, the particular fragrance of places where mountains meet sky. Nilo felt it before he understood what it meant. The sea glass in his pocket, warming against his palm as he arranged the morning's first sandwiches with Ash, both of them moving through their familiar routines with the easy grace of people who had learned to listen to the spaces between things. The sea letter appeared beneath the diner's door like a gift from the retreating mist, its envelope bearing Rhea's unmistakable handwriting. Each letter formed with the careful attention she brought to all her measurements. When Nilo opened it at the counter, where morning light painted everything gold, her voice seemed to speak directly from the pages, warm with the particular joy of someone who had found exactly what they had been searching for without knowing they were looking. Inside was a map unlike any she had drawn before, sketched on paper that felt soft as old linen, its surface marked with roots that seemed to catch and hold the light. The lines weren't just geographical but emotional, showing Nightbridge not as buildings and streets, but as a constellation of connections. The lighthouse appeared as a steady pulse, the bakery as radiating warmth, and close counters as a gentle star around which other lights arranged themselves in harmonious orbit. Along the edges, she had marked places with delicate symbols, tiny cairns, small hearts, the suggestion of hands reaching toward each other across invisible distances. "The patterns we mapped together," her letter began, "have been teaching other places how to sing in the same key. I've followed them to mountain towns where people stack stones for wishes, to coastal villages where lighthouse keepers tend more than just maritime beacons. What we discovered in Nightbridge isn't unique, but it's rare, and it's creating ripples in directions we never imagined." Ash looked up from polishing spoons, their eyes bright with the certainty that only comes from recognizing a truth before adults have finished thinking about it. "She's coming back," they whispered, and as if summoned by their words, the bell above the door offered its familiar chime, with a note of quiet contentment, as if it too had been waiting. Rhea slipped inside during the late afternoon lull, her satchel slung over her shoulder, her hair catching the soft light from the window like autumn leaves after rain. She moved with the unhurried grace of someone returning to a place that had always held a piece of her heart. And when her gaze found Nilo, the world seemed to pause for a single, perfect moment before continuing with renewed warmth. Their reunion felt less like a beginning and more like a conversation gently resumed. Over coffee and a sandwich, Nilo built with ingredients that somehow tasted of welcome and distant shores. Rhea spoke of communities she had visited, where their particular form of gentle care had taken root in unexpected ways. "But the most beautiful discovery," she said, her voice soft with wonder, "is that these places are connected by something more than shared practices. They're connected by invisible threads, a network of care that helps kindness find its way from one community to another, like migrating birds, following ancient routes home. As evening settled, over the harbor and the lighthouse beam began its eternal sweep across Ikta, water that held the first stars like scattered promises. They walked together along the cairn line Nilo had rebuilt after the rain. The sea, in its eternal rhythm, had left behind new treasures, stones polished to quiet sheen, pieces of driftwood that told silent stories of distant journeys, shells that held the echo of forgotten waves. Rhea paused at each cairn, her fingers tracing the lines of the stones Nilo had so carefully placed. "You didn't just rebuild them," she observed, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone recognizing a deeper truth. "You listened to what the ocean left behind, not just the physical pieces, but the quiet wisdom of how things want to belong to each other." She picked up a particularly smooth stone, cool and ancient in her palm. "Every tide reveals something new, doesn't it? Something that was always there, just waiting for the right moment to be seen." They found themselves on Keel's steps as stars began to claim their places in the darkening sky, the lighthouse beam painting its steady arc across the vast, patient sea. The air carried the clean scent of salt and the distant hum of the beacon, and in this familiar place where Nilo had learned about the constancy of light and the art of steady welcome, they sat in comfortable silence. "Time is a lot like bread," Rhea mused, turning the smooth stone over in her hand, her voice taking on the meditative quality that came when important truths were being spoken. "It's best when shared, the warmth of it, the way it nourishes, and it's better when it's allowed to rise slowly, to gather all its flavors. You can't rush it, not if you want it to truly sustain." Nilo nodded, thinking of the bakery's patient rhythms, of Keel's steady wisdom slowly shared, of the way their friendship had deepened through seasons of small, repeated kindnesses. The lighthouse beam swept over them like a gentle benediction, and in its steady embrace, he felt the deep satisfaction that comes from understanding that some journeys are meant to be walked together, creating ripples of care that spread far beyond what any single person could imagine. At the old rick that evening, they each placed a smooth stone warmed by their pockets, listening to the ancient hum that seemed to acknowledge all the care that had been tended in this place, all the light that would continue to shine long after any individual flame had been entrusted to other hands. The sea glass in Nilo's pocket hummed in harmony with the stones, with the rhythm of the waves, and with the quiet understanding that flowed between them like a lullaby that knew exactly where it belonged. The years gathered themselves around Nightbridge like familiar blankets, each season adding its own gentle weight to the accumulating comfort of a community that had learned to hold itself with unusual tenderness. Time moved not as a relentless current, but as a patient tide, bringing small changes that deepened the colors of everything it touched, softening sharp edges into the comfortable contours of shared experience. Nilo's hair began to catch silver at the temples. Then somewhere between one spring rain and the next, it turned the pale foam color of waves dissolving on sand. He moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had long ago chosen steadiness over haste, and people found they rested more easily when he was near. His gift had deepened over the years, becoming less about arranging physical objects and more about creating invisible architectures of care that helped others find their natural places within the gentle order of their days. He started leaving tiny cairns in doorways and gardens, 3 stones balanced with the certainty of someone who understood that the smallest gestures often carried the deepest meaning. These weren't grand monuments, but quiet blessings. Little whispers saying, "You are held. This place is remembered. Everything is going to be okay." Some mornings, a shopkeeper would discover one on their windowsill and spend the day catching themselves smiling for reasons they couldn't quite name. Mara's laughter had grown rounder over time, less careful, more willing to spill into the spaces between words. The bakery thrived with the quiet prosperity of a place that understood its purpose completely, and her movements through the familiar kitchen carried the grace of someone who had made peace with both memory and hope. She would often pause at the window shelf, where their mother's things still rested, but now the gesture felt less like visiting a shrine and more like greeting an old friend who happened to live in the arrangement of simple objects. Ash had grown into their gift the way morning light grows into day, gradually and then all at once. At 16, they moved through close counters with the fluid confidence of someone who had learned that service was a form of listening, that the right sandwich at the right moment could be as essential as any lighthouse beam cutting through fog. They had developed their own gentle rituals, a silver bell rung at sunset to mark the day's transition. Coco prepared with the same meditative attention Nilo brought to his arrangements, small acts of care that helped conversations flow more easily, and reminded lonely people they were part of something larger than their individual stories. Rhea's maps had found their natural resting places throughout the diner, under cutting boards, behind salt jars, tucked into the worn pages of cookbooks. The kitchen had become a quiet museum of roots home, each stained recipe card and faded drawing a testament to journeys taken and safe harbors found. Her notebook, once filled with urgent observations and careful measurements, now contained sketches of everyday magic, the way afternoon light fell across the booths, how steam rose from freshly poured tea, the subtle patterns of conversation that wove themselves through the diner on quiet afternoons. They established what they came to call the gentle inventory, a yearly ritual that took place on the first evening with fireflies. Everyone would bring something to count without counting. Memories, spare buttons, miracles too small to brag about. They would lay these invisible treasures on the back table, where the tailor's finished quilt rested, and say thank you under their breath. Rhea would draw a new map of the town each year to mark what had shifted and what had stayed, while Mara baked bread that tore in satisfying clouds. The fisherman would raise his mug, the schoolteacher would tap her keys against her teacup in a gentle rhythm, and together they would acknowledge the accumulating grace of another year, lived with attention to what mattered most. On evenings when the weather was especially kind, they would gather on the lighthouse steps where Keel had once taught patience and constancy. Not formally, but with the easy gravitational pull of people who had learned that some conversations were best held in places where light met darkness with steady welcome. These gatherings never felt planned, but they happened with the regularity of tide, as if the town itself was orchestrating, moments when its various forms of care could recognize each other. Darted the network of connection that Rhea had first detected with her instruments had become something they could all sense now, invisible threads that stretched from Nightbridge to other communities where people were learning to arrange their lives with the same patient attention. Occasionally guests would arrive at close counters with the look of people who had followed a story more than a road, and they would leave lighter, carrying with them the quiet understanding that care could be both given and received in the simplest gestures. At the old rick, the ancient hum continued its patient song, now joined by the accumulated wisdom of all the smooth stones Nilo had placed there over the years. When he touched the weathered surface each evening, He could feel not just the memory of his first morning in Knightbridge, but the invisible network of connection that stretched far beyond what any single person could imagine. The sea glass in his pocket had grown warm from years of handling, its edges worn smooth by countless moments of quiet gratitude. Standing at the lighthouse window one evening, watching the beam sweep its eternal arc across water that held the first stars like scattered promises, Nilo felt the deep satisfaction that comes from understanding that some work is never finished because it's always beginning again. He wasn't just tending light anymore. He had learned to be a lighthouse himself, creating conditions for others to find their own ways of helping the world remember how beautiful it could be when held with gentle hands. The stars above arranged themselves in patterns both ancient and immediate, and in their steady light, Knightbridge settled into sleep with the confidence of a community that had learned to dream together, creating ripples of care that would continue long after any individual dreamer had passed their particular light to other hands. The night arrived so clear it felt like the sea had forgotten how to blink, stars scattered across the darkness with such abundance that they seemed to be whispering secrets to their own reflections in the still water below. Nilo moved through his evening routines at close counters with the unhurried grace of someone who had learned that the most important ceremonies were often the quietest ones, his seafoam white hair catching the amber light as he prepared his final order of the day. The sandwich was built not for hunger, but for memory. A small, edible narrative of everything he had learned. 2 slices of Mara's honeyed bread, still warm from ovens that had fed the town for decades, butter spread with the patience of countless mornings, a single slice of tomato that caught the lamplight like a tiny sun, and lettuce crisp with evening dew. Each layer was stacked with the simplest comforts, carrying within it the echo of all the lessons shared, all the gentle wisdom absorbed from the world and offered back in kind. Ash looked up from wiping the last table, their movements now fluid with years of practice. "The light feels different tonight," they said, glancing toward the lighthouse beam as it swept its eternal arc, like it's saying goodbye and hello at the same time. Nilo wrapped the sandwich carefully in paper that rustled with the sound of gentle promises, understanding what his students sensed, that some endings were actually doors opening onto larger rooms. The walk through Knightbridge felt like moving through a constellation made of home. Windows glowed with the soft amber of lanterns that had learned to breathe with the town's rhythm, and in doorways, tiny cairns of 3 stones caught starlight like small prayers made visible. The fisherman's cottage hummed with contentment. The tailor's shop displayed a quilt that told stories in fabric and thread, and the schoolteacher's keys chimed softly from their red ribbon, finally understanding where they belonged. At the old rick, where sea-smooth stones had hummed their ancient song since his first morning in this place, Nilo paused. The familiar vibration rose to meet his touch, but tonight it carried something deeper, the accumulated harmony of a community that had learned to sing together. He sat on the sand where tide met shore in their eternal conversation, unwrapped his simple meal, and began to eat with the meditative attention he brought to all acts of nourishment. Each bite tasted of everything. Keel's steady wisdom shared over black coffee, Rhea's laughter sparkling like starlight on water, Mara's quiet strength anchoring them all like a lighthouse built of love rather than stone. The bread held the warmth of countless mornings, the tomato carried sunshine and rain, and together they formed a communion with all the care that had been tended in this place. As he ate, the valley began to hum, not dramatically, but with the soft vibration of kindness finding its echo. The sound rose from carefully tended gardens, where tiny cairns marked places where comfort had taken root, from windows where light still promised welcome, from hearts that had discovered the most important work was often invisible. It spread across stone and straw, through stars and counters, through the thick and thin of time, carrying stories of all who had learned to tend light in their own particular ways. When the last crumb had been savored, Nilo reached into his pocket and withdrew the sea glass Rhea had given him years ago, its surface worn smooth by countless moments of quiet gratitude. He held it up to catch the lighthouse beam, watching tiny rainbows dance against his palm like captured aurora, then placed it gently on the oldest cairn. From his other pocket, he drew a single smooth stone, warmed by decades of carrying, and set it atop the ancient stack. The hum that rose was deeper now, richer, carrying within it the wisdom of all who had ever paused here, to acknowledge the mystery of being held by something larger than themselves. It resonated through his chest, through the sand beneath his feet, through the vast star-scattered sky above, a lullaby woven from the very fabric of belonging. He stood slowly, brushing sand from his clothes, and felt himself widen, not vanish, not depart, but expand like a room opening its windows to let more night in. The lighthouse beam swept over him like a benediction, and in its steady embrace, he understood that some gifts were meant to be passed forward like flames lighting other flames, creating an endless network of illumination. With the quiet confidence of someone who had learned that the most important journeys often begin with a single step into the gentle unknown, he stepped back into the quiet, where stories rest like sleeping birds, and somewhere he's still out there napping in the sun, leaving tiny cairns in doorways and gardens, making rooms remember themselves with nothing more than steady hands, and the patient art of helping scattered things find their way home. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.